Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
How's everybody doing? Thank you all so much for coming. It is a pleasure to see so many faces I recognize, so many new faces, see my family. It really means a lot. And so I'm also very lucky to be here with my dear friend Safia, who is also the editor of this book. She is the person who I gave these poems to and was like, these poems are a mess, please help me put them together.
They were never a mess.
And then she just like did her magic, and here we are. So it's such a pleasure to be here with her. It's such a pleasure to be here with y'all. I'm gonna read some poems, and then we'll talk about poems and all sorts of other stuff, and then then we'll hear from you all, and then if you want, I'll sign your books in the back. Also, I should say, Safia and I both come from the spoken word, performance poetry, slam poetry tradition, and so we are accustomed to engagement from the audience. Sometimes when people go to poetry readings, especially like you go to poetry reading, you're in a gallery, sometimes the person will read a poem, and then the audience just stares at them. Please don't do that. That's like wildly unsettling for you, for me. Even if you're like, that was a subpar poem, just clap anyway. It's like, it's better for you, it's better for all of us. It's just much better energy in the room.
But also, don't like golf clap, like clap like you're watching sports.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Sports clap.
It's sports clap.
So some of you might have heard me talk about this over the course of the last couple of weeks on the radio or wherever, but the sort of central theme of this book is a sort of exploration of the simultaneity of the human experience, what it means to hold joy and love and laughter and levity alongside pain, despair, anxiety, and fear, and how our lives are not neatly compartmentalized in ways that allow us to have one set of emotions on one day and one set of emotions on another. It's not like Wednesday you're happy, or Monday is your happy day, Tuesday is your sad day, Wednesday is your anxiety day. Like it doesn't work like that. Oftentimes we are holding all of these, experiencing all of these things all together, all at once. And part of what I'm interested in is thinking about that in the context of the sort of larger human experience, but also through the prism of parenthood, and how parenthood is this thing that is filled with so much wonder and awe, and it's so remarkable, and it's also really exhausting and really difficult and really tiring. Parenthood is this thing that shows you the parts of yourself that you're really proud of, the parts of yourself that you love, and also can show you parts of yourself that you're not so proud of, and parts of yourself that you might be ashamed of that hadn't necessarily been revealed to you before you became a parent. And so I'm interested in like leaning into that complexity, naming that multiplicity and duality. And so the first poem in the book is a poem called All at Once, which is kind of the thesis statement of the project. All at once. The redwoods are on fire in California. A flood submerges a neighborhood that sat quiet on the coast for 3 centuries. A child takes their first steps and tumbles into a father's arms. 2 people in New Orleans fall in love under an oak tree whose branches bend like sorrow. A forest of seeds are planted in new soil. A glacier melts into the ocean and the sea climbs closer to the land. A man comes home from war and holds his son for the first time. A man is killed by a drone that thinks his jug of water is a bomb. Your best friend relapses and isn't picking up the phone. Your son's teacher calls to say he stood up for another boy in class. A country below the equator ends a 20-year civil war. A soldier across the Atlantic fires the shot that begins another. The scientists find a vaccine that will save millions of people's lives. Your mother's cancer has returned, and the doctors say there is nothing else they can do. There's a funeral procession in the morning and a wedding in the afternoon. The river that gives us water to drink is the same one that might wash us away. One of the things that I'm also thinking a lot about in this project, and this I think this is another reason why it's really wonderful to do this with Safia, who has influenced my work in more ways than she realizes. But I'm interested in the things that serve as a catalyst to our empathy and the things that serve as obstacles to our empathy. And in a sort of geopolitical sense, thinking of the ways that so often what precludes us from extending empathy or from extending mourning or an ability to grieve for certain groups of people is shaped by a line that was drawn in the sand by a group of men thousands of years ago. And how so often what dictates whether we extend empathy to different groups of people is shaped by the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance. And I think that that's another thing that parenthood has more fully illuminated for me, is how arbitrary that is. And so I'm going to read this sort of suite of poems that are wrestling with this question. And one of the things that I like about poetry more generally is that it is a genre that allows you to wrestle with a set of questions even when you don't necessarily, and doesn't necessitate that you have to come up with the answers. You can begin the poem with one set of questions and then end the poem with a new set of questions. And you don't have to make an argument, you don't have to come up with the right answer. You can simply use the poem as a space to think and to process and to excavate. So I'm going to read these three in a row. You don't have to clap between each one. And then we'll go from there. The drone. The drone was once a scrap of metal. The drone looks as if it might be a toy. The drone is not a toy. The drone could have been something else, something other than a killing machine. The drone could have been a house. The drone could have been a spoon. The drone could have been a swing. The drone does not know who it is going to kill next. The drone is going to kill next. The drone has learned to disguise itself as a shard of sky. The drone's hum is a disembodied echo. The drone was mistaken for a star once. The drone renders itself celestial. The drone scoffs at sovereignty. The drone asks, what is a border if you can fly right over it? The drone was built by a man. The drone killed a man and a woman and a child. The drone killed a child and did not see her face. The drone does not see a face. The drone sees a body, and then the body is gone. Pangea. Imagine each continent, a splintered tessellation of wayward fragments, each mass of land attempting to jostle itself free. Pangea was the last of the supercontinents, a mass of land that came together and broke itself apart several times before. It should come as no surprise. Don't we all eventually return to something we can lose ourselves inside of? Can we blame the desert for missing the breeze that tumbles across the grassland? Can we blame the tundra for its desire to witness the wrestling of pines? Just the other day, a bomb killed 70 people across the sea and no one around me heard a sound. These days, I find myself blaming Pangea for the sounds I cannot hear. I decry the continents for their careless drift. I detest the tectonic plates for their indifferent quake. I wake up in love with the ocean and fall asleep despising all that it has put between us. Perhaps if the continents had never shaken themselves free, we might find ourselves disabused of this apathy. Perhaps if we could hear the bomb dropping, we might imagine what would happen if it struck our own home. I'm nostalgic for a proximity that may not have mattered. I find myself loathing a miracle. The New York Times reports that 200 civilians have just been killed by U.S. military airstrikes, and the man on television calls it unfortunate yet inevitable collateral damage. And I wonder what it is that turns mourning into a metonym or a proclamation of conjecture. And I read his bio, and I see that he has a wife, and I can't imagine he would call it inevitable if her body were pulled from the rubble. And I see that he has a son, and I can't imagine he would call the boy who bears his name collateral in someone else's war. And I see that he has a daughter, and I think of what it might mean for someone to render her final breath in inevitability of realpolitik. And I understand what he means. I know he means that war is callous and unforgiving, that a militant can surround himself with a dozen women and children so that the pilot must decide between a target and the ache of his own heart's detonation. I do not misunderstand the cruelty of war, but I regret the way we talk about its casualties, how their lives become tacit admonitions, how the tyranny of a border made out of thin air means bombs are only dropped on one side of it. But I, too, have felt empathy corrode inside my most cavernous parts, have taken the quarters from my pocket and used them to cover my collusion. Who among us has not used spare change to cover our contrition, or laid a wreath of sympathy atop bodies with names we do not know? And I'm not sure what it means for us not to be the one to fire the bullet, but to behave as if the bullet always belonged in that chest and not our own. Something that I do sometimes, I'll look at these old poems that I wrote. I don't look at them. I imagine them because they're very bad, so I don't look at them. But I'll think about these poems from 2007, 2008 that are on YouTube somewhere. And I'm just oh God, these poems are so terrible, they're so bad, oh, these poems are trash, who is that person? Why is he using that voice? Why is he talking like that? It's just, I'm God, these poems are so bad. And I remember a conversation that Safia and I had years ago. I don't even know if she remembers, but I remember I was God, Safia, I can't even look at these poems are so trash, they're so bad. And she was you could think of them as trash, or you could think of each poem as a sort of time capsule that allows you to remember who you were at these different points in your life, almost as if they're breadcrumbs that allow you to trace who you've been over the course of your life. And how remarkable is it to have these sort of breadcrumbs, these time capsules that allow you to remember who you've been at all these different stages of your life. And I was that's a much more generous rendering of the idea than these poems are trash. But that idea has stayed with me ever since she shared it, the idea of poem as time capsule. And for me, so many of the poems in this book are sort of small time capsules, small archives of moments, especially with my kids, with my family, that I'm trying to hold on to. And so much of what makes parenthood what it is not those huge moments, it's not the graduations, it's not the weddings, it's not the big birthdays, it's those small things. It's the trips to the grocery store, it's the trips to the park, it's watching Peppa Pig for the 999th time. It's all that. And one of those things in our house is we like to have dance parties, after dinner. Unfortunately, my children have no rhythm. And they're 4 and 5 right now. So right now it's cute. If it continues, it'll be devastating. So cross your fingers for all of us. And so I'm gonna read this poem entitled Dance Party. Sometimes in the evenings after dinner, after the spaghetti has been slurped and I have bribed the broccoli into their bellies, I give both of my children the look. When my eyes meet theirs, they know what time it is. They push in their chairs, they stretch their legs, and we move the table to the far end of the dining room to clear space for what we all know is coming. Alexa, play the post-dinner dance party playlist. And within seconds, Martha Wash's booming voice rolls like thunder over our bodies. Everybody dance now. The electronic keyboard and the drums meet in the middle of the room like two dinosaurs ready to claim this kitchen as their own. Immediately, the jumping begins, and my daughter is flinging her limbs like an offbeat octopus, hands slapping the air behind her as if she is trying to smack anyone who enters her sacred space. I turn around, and my son is doing the robot, or is being eaten by a robot, or is trapped in a universe where robots take over the bodies of little boys in peanut butter pajamas. Nonetheless, there is a robot somewhere, and my children, bless them, have not yet learned how to clap on the 2 and 4, so I laugh, but also cringe, as their small hands make a mockery of the melody around them. Now, halfway through the song, everyone is jumping, and I, caught up in the ecstasy of this moment, fall to the ground and convince this no longer young body that it is a good idea to start doing the worm. And when my children see me, their eyes become pools of possibility, and it is clear they see this as a clarion call to climb onto my back. And now, here we are, this strange trifecta, this unlikely trio, a robot and an octopus riding on the back of a worm who will certainly need some Tylenol before bed. And it is in this moment that their mother comes home. And when she opens the door, everyone is screaming. The speakers are blasting, and the percussion is shaking every wall around us. We look up at her, and she looks down at us, and we have no explanation for this strange scene, only an invitation for her to join. I'll read one more poem, and then we'll chat. But I wanted to share this one because it felt important to name, both in the context of this room, in the context of this book, that the very act of me as a man writing a book largely centered on fatherhood might lend itself to a sort of praise that might not be extended to a woman writing about motherhood in the same way. And I think that's important to name directly. I think it's important to say. I think it's important to push back against. And it is a sort of literary manifestation of like patriarchy and sexism and the way that it informs the expectations we have of parents and what their roles and responsibilities are. And it's a conversation my wife and I have all the time. It's a conversation I have with other dads all the time about how we can sort of unlearn the sort of low expectations that we have inherited as fathers, even when the world praises us for doing the things that we're simply supposed to do. So this poem is called Gold Stars. On the days when I am out alone with my children, I'm made to feel as if I am a saint or a god or the undisputed best father of all time. What I mean is that when we walk into CVS and my daughter is wrapped on my chest and my son toddles at my side, people stop and look and gasp and point and walk up to me asking to shake my hand. Men pat me on the back. Women touch my shoulder and touch their hearts. The man at the front of the store comes onto the loudspeaker to say, "Excuse me, may I have everyone's attention? On aisle 7, you can get 3 boxes of detergent for the price of 2, and on aisle 5, there is an incredible father running errands alone with his children." Everyone in the store bursts into applause, and someone walks over to hand me a crown and a ribbon and a coupon for an all-you-can-eat buffet. Just the other day, a woman at the park told me how wonderful it is that I took the time to babysit my children. Just the other day, I changed a dirty diaper and someone said, "Praise Jesus." Just the other day, a man on the road stopped his car in the middle of the street, rolled down his window, and told me that I was Father of the Year. It's not that I don't appreciate the sentiment. It's just that this man has no idea what kind of father I actually am. All he saw was me and 2 children and a diaper bag teeming with crackers. It's not that I don't want people to tell me I'm doing a good job. It's just that I am praised for the sorts of things no one ever thanks my wife for. I am adorned in a garland of gold stars for simply being in this body.
See? Sports clap.
Sports clap, there you go.
Beautiful poems.
Thank you.
Beautiful book.
Thank you.
It's in the world after many, many years of being in your brain and computer. How do you feel?
It's been wild. It's been wild. I mean, it's been, we were talking about this backstage. I never could have imagined that it would move through the world in the way that it has the past 3 weeks. I mean, like, when I did the Colbert Show, like, that was bananas.
Yeah.
And I remember I was backstage and I had this moment, I was like, this is like where the Avengers come it's like where Marvel people come to promote their movies, and I'm here being like, all at once, the redwoods are on fire, you know, it's like, and so I feel just so much gratitude. I feel so fortunate to be an ambassador on behalf of poems and poets, and to hopefully use my work as an entry point for other people to, you know, find other poets and other work that they love. And I'm always trying to point people in the direction of other incredible poets, and to, I think part of my project more generally as a writer is like a rejection of the idea that intellectual rigor or artistic integrity like has to come at the expense of legibility and accessibility. And I think that shapes the sort of history writing that I do. I think it shapes the type of poems that I write. Part of that is a stylistic choice, a personal choice, but I just feel very fortunate that people have like resonated with them in that way.
Yeah. Also, in case y'all didn't know, this book is a New York Times bestseller, a poetry book. And, you know, you already knew this was coming because you can't be doing like multi-genre work without me asking you about genre. But what really strikes me every time I read your work is you're like an incredibly multidisciplinary writer, but it's your voice throughout, you know? So like you write nonfiction like a poet, you write poems like a historian, you know? But I'm wondering, like, are they different parts of your brain? Is it a different process for you? Is it a different looking for you? Like, does the separation occur, or?
Yeah, it's yes and no. I mean, I think that one, I feel like we are part of a tradition and a sort of lineage of black writers in this country that have always written across genre, right? Like that have even the ones that we lift up as and talk about as if they only wrote in one genre, like Langston Hughes, for example. Like the way we talk about Langston Hughes, or the way we're taught about Langston Hughes, is that like Langston Hughes was a poet. And that's kind of like, I remember when I learned about it, it was like, oh, Langston Hughes is a poet, and this person's a novelist, and this person's an essayist, and this person, and it's like, no, like Langston Hughes was a war correspondent in Spain, he was a essayist, he was a playwright, he was a novelist, he was a journalist, he was a poet, he did oral histories, and it's the same, you know, you look at Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was an anthropologist, was an essayist, was a playwright, was a novelist, they did so many of my forebears, I feel like, did work across discipline, because the tradition of black studies is one that recognizes that the questions, the genre or the form, the medium you use to create in, or to write in, is informed not by this idea that you have to stay in your lane, but is informed by the question you're asking, right? And so different questions lend themselves to different forms, different ideas, different processes of excavation and exploration might be better suited in one form than another. And sometimes it changes over the course of a project. So for How the Word Is Passed, I thought when I started How the Word Is Passed, I thought it would be my second poetry collection. And so I watched the Confederate statues come down in May of 2017 in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I thought that I was going to write a collection of poetry in which the conceit was me writing about all these different monuments in New Orleans and what my relationship was to them. And so I started writing these poems, and poetry for me is both the creation of art, but also the mechanism through which I do my best thinking. It's like a mindfulness practice. It's a kind of, it's as I've said, you know, so many times over the course of this tour, like poetry for me is the act of paying attention. And it allows me to explore, to pay attention both to the exterior world, but also to my own interiority, and like what my relationship to the world around me is, and try to make sense of it in a different way. And so I started writing How the Word Is Passed, and it was like a lot of poems. And then I think I realized, okay, well, I think I need a little bit more space than the poems are offering. So then I started writing these sort of like lyric essays, and then I was like, okay, well, I think I need like to go to other places beyond monuments. Like it's about iconography, but it's beyond iconography. So then I started going to different sites and then writing these sort of longer meditative essays on like going to these different places. And then I was like, well, if I'm interested in the like complexity and the heterogeneity of our collective memory in this country, and like how all of us remember the history of this country in such different ways, then I need to include other voices in the project, and which meant I had to like go up to people and talk to them. And people, it's interesting because there's this like very neat narrative that formed after How the Word Is Passed came out, where it was like poet and journalist Clint Smith goes off to, explore history. And I was like, who's a journalist? Like, who are they talking? Like, because I didn't think of myself that way at all. When I started How the Word Is Passed in 2017, I was like a graduate student procrastinating on writing my dissertation. And so they were like journalists. And so the idea, I think people assume because of the book that like I'm like a natural reporter and like, oh man, he just like can go up to white people on plantations and ask them questions. And it's like, no, it's not. Like, I had to be in the car and be like, all right, here we go. I had to like pump myself up. People just like, wow, you like really, like, I can't believe you like set out to go meet with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And I was like, I did not set out to go meet with the Sons of Confederate Veterans at all. Like, that was not part of the plan. But part of what I realized was like that is, as I got clearer on what questions the book was wrestling with, I became clear on what form the project needed to take. And so ultimately it became this sort of, like a sort of genre-bending, reported, memoir-esque, archival exploration, this sort of narrative journey in a way that it didn't begin. And I tell young writers this all the time, but I mean, I probably spent a year and a half working on that book before I got to what was ultimately like the first sentence of what would end up in the book. So I wrote probably like 40 or 50,000 words, like 150 pages over the course of a year and a half, and none of that ended up in the book itself. And I think for some writers, especially when you're young, you can be made to feel as if like when you start writing, you're supposed to just like, if it's good, it's good. If it's not, it's not. Like, but writing is just, it's like practice, and I think because I played soccer my whole life, and writing is like the thing that I thought I was going to be a professional soccer player growing up, and then you grow up and realize that Louisiana is not a hotbed of soccer talent against which to compare your skills on a global level. So I was very humbled when I got to college, and I rode the bench the whole time. But I think what it did was force me to figure out what I cared about outside of it. But I think I bring those sensibilities of playing sports my whole life to writing, because it's like, you don't show up on the soccer field on the weekend and just like have a great game or score a hat trick. Like you have to put in hours and hours of work practicing that people never see, so that what people see on game day is the manifestation of that hard work. It's the same if you play an instrument. Like if you're a musician, you don't just show up to the concert and play like Coltrane or play like Bach. You put in hours and hours of work that people never see, so that when you show up to the concert, it is the manifestation of that work that you put in. And I think of writing a book the same way. Like I don't sit down and the book comes out fully formed. I mean, you know that, we write together all the time. Like I think we know that to be true, but I think it's important to say, because sometimes people don't approach writing in the same way. Like sometimes people think when you sit down and write, it's supposed to come out fully formed, when like writing is just revision and failing and practicing and throwing out most of what you write. We've done 30/30s before, which is when you write a poem a day, or you attempt to write a poem every day of the month. Safia will make it to 30. I'll peter out at like 16.
I get to like 7 and they're always late. But thank you for the generosity.
But let's say you do write 30 poems in a month, like 4 of those poems are good, or like okay enough to one day be good. Right. But you have to write those other 26 to get to the ones that ultimately are going to be in the book. There's 70-something poems in this book. I wrote hundreds of poems to get to these poems. So yeah, I mean, that's the way that I sort of think about it and approach it. It's not a waste of time. It's just kind of it's just part of the process.
And how did you arrive at this thinking? Because I also remember being a young writer, and I used to, we came up in the slam, and so a lot of my early writing, nothing was ever just like writing for the sake of writing. It was always like for something. And so I was introduced to kind of not very helpful terminology, like, is this poem usable or is it not usable? Like things like that. But it really gets in the way of like becoming the writer you're actually trying to be when it's like, all right, I'm gonna write this first draft and then go read it to people.
Yeah.
You know. But so at what point, like, were you aware at any point of your thinking kind of, I guess, growing up, you know, from being like, well, not every one of these poems has to be a masterpiece. Some of these poems are just me, like, revving my engine a little bit, you know?
I mean, I think that, there's so many, I wouldn't be where I am, like, without the slam community, without that time. And I think there were things that were really generative about that space, and I think things that were less generative that we had to step out of the space to like come into ourselves more fully as writers. But I will say that especially when I first started, the nature of Poetry Slam is you write a thing and you go share it in front of an audience, and then these random strangers give you a score, and that is like what shapes your self-esteem for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And what is true is that if you go and you do a poem that people think is bad, they will let you know that it's bad, and then you're like, okay, this is either you, like I said, put it aside, or you revise it until it gets better. And so I think that for me, like, there was always a community, there was a space where I got a sense of the poems, where the poem was efficient, where the poem was effective, where the poem was doing what I thought it would do in my head, and where it wasn't. I think that it also slam was interesting because I think many writers, when they begin writing, like, writing is such a solitary endeavor, and when you start in like the slam scene, the open mic scene, it didn't feel solitary at all.
Literally,
right?
a team sport.
It's a team sport. You know, you're on a team with people, even if you're not on a team or participating, it's like you get on stage and you create work with a specific intention of sharing it in front of an audience.
Also, you need other people to throw a slam or to put on an open mic.
Right, and so my idea of what it meant to be a writer was very much tied up in community, right? Like, I couldn't think of, like, writing wasn't something I felt lonely or isolated in. It was something that felt very communal, right? In fact, that was my community. In New Orleans, in DC, in college for so long. And I feel very grateful for that idea, like, because it never felt like something that took me away from the world. It felt like something that more fully brought me into it.
And what was it? Because I feel like so many young people have like the creative impulse, and the thing that makes people start to drop off is it's just like, it's hard to not be good at something, you know? So what was it for you that, like, what was the engine? What made you want to be good? What made you want to, like, keep reaching for the thing and missing and, like, dusting yourself and doing it again?
I think I was sort of processing this in another interview, but I think it was the competition part of it, right? I think that for me, having played sports my whole life and been like a very competitive person, the idea that there was like competitive writing, right? Like, people give you score. It felt like a sport, right? It is a sport. I mean, like, you get on stage, you get a score, you like win or you don't win, you get a prize if you win. It felt like it was such a good, for me at that time, it was such a helpful entry point into the world of writing that it was like a bridge that allowed me to go from this part of my life to that part of my life. I think there are also limits to like making everything you write centered on a competition, and I think ultimately that's like when it can be helpful to step away from it and say, this was a really generative space, this is a really generative exercise. Also, you can find yourself writing the same kind of poem over and over again, with the same sort of narrative, the same sort of like, beginning, middle, and end. And so it felt, I think it is this space, and it's so cool because I think so many of us, like, who are part of this like cohort of friends that we have, came up in this space, and I think would all say the writers we are today would not have been possible without that space, and also are now working in like all sorts of genres and mediums. People are writing novels and writing for television and writing movies and writing books of sociology and writing and doing journalism and the folks I came up with the slam scene in college in my early 20s are now doing such creative, incredible genre-bending work. But I do think that there's something to be said for the way that the the slam scene served as a sort of incubator. And we saw what the possibilities of it were, what the limits of it were, and we took it and made it into something that helped us gain clarity around like what kind of writers we were and what kind of writers we wanted to be.
And has fatherhood changed you as a poet at all?
I think fatherhood in general has like made me much sillier. I think my kids have given me a distorted sense of how funny I am. I think because I'll like say something and they like fall down laughing. And they just keep laughing. And I'm just like, man, I am hilarious. Right? Like, I gotta really like leave this journalism and poetry thing behind. I need to hit the road, like stand-up comic. Like that's what, really, I mean, it's the power of poop jokes, right? Like the possibilities are endless. But I think that in my writing, I hadn't tapped into silliness in the same way. I think in part because I had an idea, which I think many of us have to some degree, or have had at some point to some degree, that like to be a serious writer meant you had to write about serious things, and that if you wanted your work taken seriously, it had to have a level of solemnity. It had to excavate trauma. It had to a history of and look, like I wrote a book about the history of slavery, so like I think it is deeply important to take seriously and to engage with and to write about things that are historically traumatic, interpersonally traumatic, histories of violence, oppression, and our lives are not singularly defined by those histories, singularly defined by those manifestations of violence. And I think my kids almost like unlocked permission within me. I think my kids combined with other writers who I think stepped very forcefully into that space, like a Ross Gay, who demonstrated that you could have work of, you can also unpack this idea, but like, high literary merit, or like that was like good writing, that was serious writing, that was also silly writing, that was also reveling in like levity and laughter and joy and gratitude. And I think that is a new part of my writing that I almost didn't feel like I had permission to access before. Or if I did access it, that it was just for me and not something that would like end up in a book. So I think that that part of my writing, that part of my life more generally, is possible because kids just, you take yourself, they make me take myself much less seriously, because they don't care about all the like, the stuff. They're just like, when you get home, are you gonna be a choo-choo train? Are you gonna be a brachiosaurus? Like, are you about that brachiosaurus life?
Yeah.
That's all that matters. and all the other stuff, like, they don't care what awards you won, they don't care, it's
Right.
just like, and those moments are also a reminder, I think, for me of like, it just is helpful perspective taking, where amid all the sort of, whatever your professional goals are, or, whatever professional accomplishments you have, that you have these, especially when they're young, like these little humans for whom all of that is irrelevant. Like all they care about is who you are when you are with them. And I think the poems, help, in their own way, help remind me of that.
Yeah. It's also, I can't tell you what a treat it is to laugh at a poetry reading, because I don't know if I've ever done that before. And I feel like the poets that we know, the poets that I know, are some of the funniest people I have ever met.
Yeah.
And you would never know it by reading the poems. You read the poems and it's always like, are y'all okay?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
does it get better? So it's really beautiful to just watch like the kind of double lives that I feel like I've seen so many of us just be kind of absorbed into each other and have a life on the page. And also be like poems that are like held to the standards that you hold all of your poetry to. You know what I mean? Like the poems can be funny and they can be silly, but you're still doing craft work there. You know what I mean? It's not just like a throwaway for the laughs and then you go back to writing serious poetry. It's all like you're like a full poet in all capacities. And I think that really is so liberating and such a relief, honestly. You know what I mean?
I think you're exactly right. Like it's not it's not mutually exclusive. It shouldn't be mutually exclusive or understood as such. And it goes back to the central idea of the collection, right? Like the multiplicity of ourselves, the all-at-onceness of who we are. Like I am like someone who thinks about the history of inequality. I am someone who spent several years writing a book on the history of slavery, and like I like having dance parties with my kids and making French toast and like, you know, pretending to be a dinosaur. And that you don't have to, sometimes, again, like maybe it's a literary thing, but I think in so many professional, I think so much, just generally as adults, sometimes we feel like we can only present one part of ourselves, or a certain part of ourselves, and I think I'm trying to more fully assert the fullness of myself in all of the spaces that I enter. And that just feels important, right? Because I don't think it is useful. I don't know that it's useful to always feel like you need to compartmentalize different parts of yourself. I mean, obviously there are certain places where like doing certain things is appropriate and doing other things isn't, but you know, this book felt important, especially coming after How the Word Is Passed, in part because it felt like an assertion of that multiplicity. And you know, coming out of How the Word Is Passed is too, like, the books are in conversation with one another in a range of ways, but one of those is that I think about how like the first enslaved people came to the British colonies that would become the United States in 1619. Slavery didn't end until 1865. But what's true is that from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom, they were fighting for liberation, they were fighting for emancipation. What that also means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience for themselves. But they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about how my life is only possible, how my children's lives are only possible because of generations of people who fought and struggled for something they knew they might never see, but they did it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And how these moments with my kids, like making French toast with my kids, having a dance party with my kids, watching my kids go down the slide, watching my kids smell a flower, like all of these moments are only possible because of generations of struggle for people who made them possible for us. And so in that way, this book is also like a way to extend gratitude to that lineage, that sort of ancestral lineage, the group of people who made these moments possible for us. It feels deeply important to revel in what they made possible, because if we don't appreciate these moments that they made possible, then we're losing part of an understanding of like what people have fought for in the first place. And I think it also bestows upon me like a sense of, okay, well, what are my responsibilities? What are my kids' responsibilities to build the sort of world that we might not see, but that someone, you know, we might never know will be able to bear the fruits of our labor and be able to revel in moments that we can't even imagine because of work that we're doing. It's almost like we're all chipping away at this wall. And you don't know if the wall is 6 inches thick or 6,000 miles thick, but you know the more you chip away at it, the less the people who come after you will have to chip away at. And like that's what we're doing. We just are all waking up every day and just like using our little chisels to chip as much away as we can. And sometimes it can feel like nothing's changing. Sometimes it can feel like nothing is moving, but you have to always remember, I think part of what this book helps me remember, How the Word Is Passed helps me remember, what my kids help me remember, is that even in the moments where it feels like things aren't changing, you are getting closer to the other side of that wall that someone else will be able to experience.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. How much of like, cause you know, you talk about how when you were a kid you wanted to be a professional soccer player when you grew up, but how much of your life now, like, was part of the dream for a younger version of yourself?
None of it. I mean, I really, like, it is hard to overstate the extent to which I was like, I just want to be Thierry Henry, right? Like, I just want to play for Arsenal. I want to move to London. I want to make $1 bajillion and just like be a legend, like, and win the World Cup. And like, I mean, that's what, from age 6 to 18, that's all I wanted. And I was writing was always something that I enjoyed. And you know, I told this story on Colbert about like Miss Mueller, my 3rd grade teacher, who told me, who read my poem and told me that I could be a writer one day, and how I never forgot that. But it's not as if in that moment I was like, I'm going to be a writer. It just is something that was put in my head, put in my consciousness as a possibility. And so I think I felt very lucky to go to, have ended up at a place like Davidson that was like a small liberal arts college in which most of the people, so many people there were student athletes. And they really emphasized figuring out like who you were beyond the field. Because I think it's not an uncommon thing for someone to be like a star of their high school team and then to go to college and not be the best person on that team anymore, or be far from the best person on that team anymore. And so, it was a place where I got, or the way that it happened in some ways is I had an internship in New York City. And my friend, Mariana Shepard, this was the summer of 2008, so between my sophomore and junior year. My friend Mariana Shepard, who was a fellow intern, one Friday night, she was like, let's go to the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. And I was like, the what? Like, I don't know what that is. Mission Impossible 2 is out. Let's go see that Tom Cruise movie. And she was like, boo, you're whack. We're not going to go see Mission Impossible 2. We're going to the New Eurekan. So she put me on a subway. We went to the New Eurekan. And you are obviously very familiar with it, having been in New York. But it's, for those who aren't, it's this sort of mecca of poetry on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I walked in and like the DJ's playing like old school hip hop, people are doing the electric slide, people are drinking and dancing and singing. I was like, what kind of poetry reading is this? Like, and I remember one of the first poems I ever heard was by a woman who had cerebral palsy. And she got on stage and did this poem about living with her condition. And she got off stage, and I never thought about disability the same way again. Like, I left that room never thinking about that condition as I had when I entered that room. I couldn't remember the last time I was so viscerally moved by art. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but I want to do it. And I went back to Davidson, and this is like pre-season. My old college roommate is here, and I remember I went to him, we were like playing Madden, and I was like, I'm gonna be a poet. And he was like, what? Shut up. Like, and I was like, no, I'm gonna do it. And I was at a place where I was like, I told like the administrator, I was like, can I start a poetry group? And they were like, sure. And they like gave me some money. We started a poetry group, and we met in the basement of the library and like basically like cosplayed Dead Poets Society. And just like read a lot of poems, performed a lot of poems. We were like watching YouTube videos of Safia and we were like, how can we do it like that? And it just was, I felt very lucky to be in a space that afforded me the opportunity to like figure out who I was and tap into parts of myself that I hadn't really known were there. Like, I'd never thought of myself as an artist, never thought of myself as like a poet, like it just, but I was in a place and in a space that afforded me the opportunity to like excavate that part of myself. And I feel very fortunate to have done so.
Well, I think this is the question I always want to ask every artist because I'm nosy. And, I have kind of a sense of your answer because we write together a lot, but humor me for the sake. But just what is your writing life like? What are your days like? Do you write every day? Is it just like in spurts? How does it work?
Yeah, it's, it's kind of all over the place. I remember I had a conversation when my son was born with the writer and scholar Monty Perry. And she's been a friend and a sort of mentor. And I remember we got together. She had 2 boys, a single mom, and is just like wildly prolific. Just written so many remarkable books. And she was like, you have to let go of this idea that your writing life is going to be like you sitting by the window with your cup of like herbal tea and the sun moving through the shades and striking your cheek just so. And like, long riding retreats in the woods. And she was like, you got to write where you can, when you can, and lean into that. Like, even if it's just like 15 minutes, like write that paragraph. Even if you are not at home, like figure out how to create a writing practice in places that aren't necessarily comfortable for you. And so I got very used to, my son's about to turn 6, and so for the last 6 years, it's been like, I write in the bar, when I'm waiting for the barbershop. I write when I'm at the DMV. I write in the line when I'm waiting to pick my kids up from school. I, like when they were younger and would fall asleep in the car seat a lot, like if we were driving around, they would fall asleep in the car seat, and then I would like pull up outside of a Starbucks, and then I'd try to get on the Wi-Fi on my computer while they stayed asleep in the car, and I'm like, please connect. So I like brought my laptop everywhere. I bring a notebook everywhere. Sometimes I wrote a lot in like the notes section of my iPhone, and then would just like copy paste it later. During nap time, during episodes of Daniel Tiger, during like just all, I got very good at writing on planes, writing in airport terminals. I think for me, I let go of the idea that I had to like wait for inspiration to strike, and recognize that writing is something that I had to be very proactive in creating space for. Because I think it can be, if you want to write and you are like waiting for the perfect time to do it, it's like life is complicated, and like you got kids you got to take care of, your parents or grandparents you got to take care of, responsibilities, all kind of stuff. And I think that instead of waiting for writing time to find you, you have to create it. Like you have to put it in your calendar. You have to be the one to figure out how to write in spaces that aren't comfortable. And again, it's not all writers are different. Some writers are like, that's cute, Clint, but like, no. And it's just, but that's what works for me. Like I'm good at focusing in different places that have like, and just like getting writing done in whatever way it needs to get done. And I think that that's part of why, this book was able to come out not so long after How the Word Is Passed, and I wrote How the Word Is Passed and my dissertation at the same time, which was a terrible decision.
Wild.
You should never do that. But I just, like if there's one, I'm much better at focusing than I am at writing. Like my superpower, I think, as a writer is the ability to focus in like random places. And so much of writing is just like getting something on the page, and then you figure out how to mold it into a thing later. It's like doing pottery. I say that, and then whenever I sat down with pottery, it's like, it's terrible. I'm like, oh, it's like pottery, and then I do pottery, and it's like, oh, what's that? And it's all lopsided, but it's, you can't do anything unless the clay is there, right? So you like have to put the clay on the spinny thing, in order to like make the pot.
Yeah.
And writing's the same thing. You got to put words on the page, even if those words don't make sense and are incoherent, but they give you something to work with. And that's kind of how I think about it.
Nice. Okay, last question, I promise, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. But what are you most excited about these days?
Just in life.
In general.
Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, so this is the last official stop of the Above Ground tour. I've been doing. So it's been like 11 cities in 16 days, and so I'm like kind of delirious. I'm like, where am I? What day is it? So I fly back home tomorrow. Just excited to be with my family.
Yeah.
I love my kids, love my wife. I'm excited for, like, it's every weekend when you have young kids, it feels like every weekend there's a toddler birthday party. And people are like, what are you doing this weekend? It's like, bro, you know what I'm doing this weekend. I'm going to the birthday party. We're going to have Domino's pizza. We're going to have the cupcakes. We're going to see you next weekend to the same parents, and then see you again. I'm going to try to be watching the Arsenal game on my iPhone. But again, it's like, it's those things. It's those moments that, like, make the whole thing what it is. And so I'm excited to get back in. Like, tour has been amazing. It's been so fun. I've started it with Elizabeth Acevedo, our dear friend, is who I started the tour with in DC. I'm ending it with Safia, which feels so appropriate because the three of us have been writing together for years now. Like during the pandemic, but when we all lived in DC, we would get together all the time and write together. When we moved apart and when COVID happened, every week, every Friday, we would get together and like share pages that we had been working on through the week before. And it's just like, Safia and Liz have been such incredible like accountability partners, such incredible friends. Like we're able to talk about things that sometimes it feels like that you don't, they're just so familiar with my work. Both of them made this collection possible. It was their eyes and their edits and their notes that helped make the book what it was. And so it's been amazing. Tour has been so fun. It's also just like it's like exhausting to be on a plane every day. I don't know how like professional musicians do it. Like how you go on like a world tour for like months and months. But it's so I'm excited to get home, and I'm excited for like soccer practices and birthday parties and dance parties and all that.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for a few questions. Just a little reminder, questions around here typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short, and this is not a venue where we accept two-part questions.
How would you say the two of you have grown as writing support for each other, editor-writer together, over time?
Like, I don't have a lot of, like, accountability partners, It literally is just Liz and Clint who are down to do the, like, really intense thing of being like, let's log on to Zoom at the exact same time once a week and workshop our writing for 2 to 3 hours. And I don't know that without that structure, I'm not like you, Clint. I wasn't an athlete. I don't really have discipline, And the only way to grow as a writer is just by like continued exposure to the thing. You got to work the muscle. You have to do the kind of like rough and unglamorous exercise part of it. And it's hard for me to do that work just in a vacuum, Similar to what you were saying, I have only ever experienced this as a team sport. But because, we grow up and we move apart and life is different now, and so it's harder to have teammates. And so I don't take it for granted that y'all are my like literal teammates in this thing, and sometimes it feels like it's the main reason I put words on a page as often as I do is because I like don't want to let you guys down and be like the person that didn't do my homework,
Yeah, I mean, I think that like gentle, compassionate accountability is like such a helpful thing. I mean, because even if Safia and I do a 30-30, there are no consequences if one of us doesn't do the poem. But like it's just that little nudge that like, somebody's expecting a poem in their inbox today. That makes it so that you spend 30 minutes writing a poem rather than like scrolling TikTok. I don't even scroll TikTok. I'm the old person that like finds the TikTok video 2 weeks later on Instagram. And so like, but like it can just be so, and then you're like, how did I just spend the last 45 minutes like scroll, doing this thing that like, you didn't have to do. And instead it's just this little nudge in your brain. That's like, oh, like I'm supposed to do this thing, but like it doesn't feel like punitive, It's a sort of affirming nudge. It's a nudge that's like, oh, this is the thing you want to do. Here's a reminder to do it. I think the other part is that I've learned so much about revision and how just like most of writing is revision. So like Safia and we all started at the beginning of lockdown with these projects and these ideas. And I was like finishing How the Word Is Passed, and I was like starting to think about what my next project would be aside from this one. But I watched, so like Safia's gonna have a new book come out next year. Liz has her first adult novel coming out in August. And I watched both of those books like
From
born
scratch.
from nothing. And I watched as like the first draft came in, and then I watched it become the second draft, and the third draft, and the fourth, and I just watched these works evolve over the course of months and over the course of years. And it was just to think about like what sort of, I think Safia's different because Safia's first drafts are like, you wrote this in 20 minutes? Like what? And I think that my first drafts are not as elegant, but it just was to see where writing begins and where it ends was just a reminder that like that is so much of the work. Again, it's like you have to have something on on the spinny thing to make. Like, and if you don't have that, so I just watched them put words on the page and then like mold those words into something remarkable. But it didn't happen overnight, and it was work, and it's a muscle. It's like going to the gym. Like it's the thing that you do, and it's the same way that going to the gym for a lot of people, like it's helpful when you have an accountability partner, right? You're like, I know this is good for me. I really don't feel like doing it, but like Joe's gonna be at the gym, and I told him I would meet him there. It's kind of the same thing, right? Having a writing group is like, you're like, oh, like Friday, 3 o'clock, you're both excited to see your friends, but also like, on Thursday at 7 p.m., you're like, dang, I better write something. But I think that's good for you. And I know that I have written so much more, and I've learned so much about myself and about my friends as writers it's been really important for me.
I love the poem Nomenclature. Can you talk about that? And I saw that you said it was after Safia. So
Yeah.
I wanted you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, what's the name of the poem that it?
Vocabulary.
Vocabulary. So Safia wrote this beautiful poem, Vocabulary, that it just stayed with me forever since I first read it. And that was in January Children? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was, when I'm writing, the way that I begin, especially poetry, it's hard for me to write without reading something first, right? So it's almost like reading, to continue with the sports analogy, like reading is like the warm-up before you start moving more actively in your own work. And so, because sometimes there's a word or a line or an idea that you just find so compelling, and it serves as a jumping off point for your own work. And so I remember reading that poem, and one day I picked it up and had sort of rediscovered it. And I was like, oh, I like this concept, this conceit is something that I can put in conversation with a set of ideas as it relates to my children and lineage and language and what it means for my children to be both the descendants of enslaved people and the descendants of people from Nigeria, right, from the continent. And how do we think about the legacy of slavery and the legacy of colonialism? How do we think about what it means for their grandmother to speak a language that they don't? What does it mean? What things are passed down to children and what things aren't? What are the sort of heirlooms that we pass on, and what are the heirlooms that sort of melt away over the course of generations? And it was just such a beautiful entry point for me to think about language and lineage. And so that poem served as a sort of template for my own. And I love those moments where I think, because it's almost like your work being in conversation with your friends, your work being in conversation with another artist. I really loved writing that because it felt like it feels to talk to Safia, except the poems were talking to each other.
How has teaching, including your work teaching in jails and prisons, influenced you as a writer, as a creator?
Yeah, it is the single most important thing that I did in graduate school. So I worked in prisons and jails, teaching writing and literature for the 6 years that I was in grad school, up until the pandemic. And then I haven't been back in since. But it was just, for me, I'm somebody who needs to regularly interface and engage with the real human tactile thing that I'm studying, because otherwise I will lose a sense of the moral urgency behind it. So when I started graduate school, I was studying the relationship between education and incarceration. My dissertation ended up being on how people sentenced to juvenile life without parole experience educational programs while they're incarcerated, because a lot of the people I had taught were men who were sentenced to life without parole as children. The United States is the only country in the world that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole. And I was like, well, what does education mean to you? Oh. Man, that's like wildly unsettling. They're always listening. They're always listening.
I feel like she was about to answer the question.
No, I mean, truly, I'm about to have some Instagram ads on like prison education. But it was like, for me, spending time with, if I was just sitting around in Cambridge, like reading Foucault and like reading sort of theory, it's important, but it also, you can just lose, you can forget that it's not just an intellectual exercise and that there's like actual people who are impacted, who are three-dimensional, who are complex, who come from all sorts of circumstances and backgrounds. And it just was that time, you know, every week going into a prison and getting to know these guys that I was working with was just a reminder of like the human stakes of the work and kept me grounded. And I think that's part of why in my nonfiction and historical work, it feels important for me to go to the places, right? I think it's that same sensibility. It's like I have to put my feet in the soil. I have to stand in the building. I have to hear the way the wood creaks when I step on it. I have to feel the sun like strike my cheek when it slides through the crack in the roof. Like I have to be there. I have to experience the sensory element of it to be reminded of the three-dimensionality of it. And I think that's what teaching in prisons is. So I think in all of my work, it's just I need to go there. I need to talk to the people. I need to be in the places, because otherwise I don't think I have a full sense of it, and thus I am ineffective in communicating to my readers the full sense of it.
Clint, I interviewed you last February for my company's Black History Month, and I had just found out that I was a few weeks pregnant at the time, so now I have a 6-month-old baby.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
And we've read him a lot of your poetry, and he's not really getting it, but I'm curious, now that I'm so in babyland, if there are any books or shows that you've read with your kids that have sparked something for you creatively.
I mean, I love the, I'm forgetting the author, but there's a series, it's like, there's Rosie Revere, engineer, there's, man, I guess it's because I'm sitting on it. I thought putting on an airplane mode would stop it, but the Aaron Slater, illustrator, what's the one, Ada Twist, Scientist, like my kids love all those books. They love the Peter Reynolds books. There's one called The Word Collector, about a little boy who like collects words, and then like at the end it's very beautiful. He like throws the words off of a hill, and all the kids run around collecting the words underneath. And I love it because, and I love his books because it has these black protagonists, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything other than like a kid being a kid, you know? And so I think more generally the way I think about it is that I think it's very important for my kids to understand the history from which they come. I think it's very important for my kids to understand the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of empire. And we talk about those things with my kids. Obviously, you do it in a way that's developmentally appropriate so that a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old can understand. But I don't believe that you wait until a kid is like 13 to start talking to them about some of these things. You talk to them in a way that's developmentally appropriate, but you start those conversations very early. At the same time, I don't want my kids to ever feel as if their lives or their histories are singular, as we were saying before, are singularly defined by those traumas, by those iterations of violence, by that oppression. I want them to be clear that the possibilities for their lives are only limited by their imagination. And so we got the kids' books about, you know, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Coretta Scott King and Ida B. Wells, and we have the books about the little black girl who wants to grow up and be a scientist, and the little black boy who wants to grow up and be an engineer, and the little black child who wants to grow up and be a bottle of ketchup, right? Like you just, like all of it. And I think that's, you know, I just want my to come back to the very beginning, like all at once, right? All of it together. It's not one or the other. You don't choose this and not choose that. It's you present them with all of it, and you let them hold the totality of it. And I think that, you know, we're very fortunate to be in a moment where there's so many more children's books with protagonists of color than maybe there've ever been. And so many of them are tied to civil rights or slavery or social justice, and a lot of them are tied to like pizza and donuts and rainbows, right? And that's how it should be, right? It's that you want all of those things, and you want to share all of that with your kids so that they have a sense of a balance, a sense of an ability to move through the world informed, with context that helps them understand the world, and also context that helps them like imagine a new world.
Okay, so how does your title of your anthology, Above Ground, sort of umbrella the ever vast concepts of and ideas that you're trying to manifest? Like, how does it culminate them into the anthology that it is?
Yeah, I need to get a suit like you, man.
Yeah.
Out here looking fly. Here's my cousin. So, this is my guy. I haven't seen him since he was so much younger, and now he's like out here using words called like culminate. No, he's a young genius. I think that, you know, the idea of above ground is, I mean, it's meant to have multiple meanings, but part of it is meant to be, you know, just like what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human, like on Earth, you know, above, like literally above ground. The poem is taken from the poem Above Ground, which is when I was watching my kids, maybe I guess a year and a half ago now, like look at the cicadas that come to DC every 17 years. And it was this moment where I was watching my kids, who at the time were 4 and 2, and the way that it works is like the cicadas live underground for 17 years, they rise up, they mate, and then they die, and the sort of like exoskeletons of these bugs are all over the place. And so I remember my kids were like walking around the lawn and kind of collecting the exoskeletons of cicadas like they were treasure, and like putting them in their Halloween buckets, and like running around to see who could collect the most. And I had this moment where I was like, the next time the cicadas come, my children will be 21 and 19. And it just is this, I think it's a microcosm of like how fleeting it all is, how fast it all is. I mean, the last time I saw you, you were like 7, you know? And like, and now you wear better suits than me. And so, so it's just, it just all happens so fast. And so I think it sort of embodies this idea of like a desire to pay attention to what's in front of you right now. Because it can be so easy to overlook the things that are worth celebrating. It can be so easy to sort of glaze over the things that are these like tiny miracles that make life worth living. And I think amid the despair and social and geopolitical and ecological catastrophe, we can forget all of these tiny miracles that exist in front of us. And the hope is that this book, for me, and then hopefully for readers, will remind us of like, to not ignore that which evokes despair, but to also remind ourselves like that there are a lot of things that evoke joy and laughter and things worth celebrating.
And our final question for the evening.
Hello, thank you, and thank you for these books. Thank you for putting that out into the world. I considered how the word has passed an invitation to visit, I think, 12 sites of enslavement in the last year.
Oh.
I'm curious what you hope descendants of enslavement, Black people in general, because right, that's what I got from Above Ground. What do you hope for the history and relationship that we have to our history and sites of enslavement in the future.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I think the idea that I hope people leave is very present in the epilogue of the book, which is just this idea that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago, wasn't that long ago at all. I mean, in the epilogue of How the Word Is Passed, I interviewed my grandparents. My grandmother, born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. My grandfather, born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi. And I'm walking through the National Museum of African American History and Culture with them. I'm pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair, and my grandmother is walking a few paces ahead of us. And I remember having this moment where I was watching them look at these exhibits in the museum and realizing that so much of the history that's documented in this museum are things that they experienced firsthand, and things that they were like intimately proximate to in ways that I hadn't fully appreciated. And I thought about the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a woman named Ruth Bonner. And she rang the bell in 2016 with the Obama family to sort of symbolically open the museum. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was the daughter of a man who was born into slavery. Like my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 5-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine him sitting on his grandfather's lap, and I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago. It just wasn't that long ago at all. So I went on this trip to England a few years ago, and I remember we went on this tour of Oxford University, and they were like, we got a tour guide, and he was like walking around showing us all these different places at Oxford. He was like, this great poet wrote this poem in this building. This great scientist did this experiment in this building, and this great philosopher wrote this treatise in this building. And they came to one building, and he looked at the building and looked at us, and looked at the building and looked at us. And he was like, this building was built around 1020. And I was like AM or PM? I couldn't even conceive of the idea that a building that was still standing up had been built like a millennium ago, right? That people were still walking out in and out of it. But I say it because it's a reminder that the U.S.'s history is so young. It's so recent relative to the rest of the world. We're like the annoying preteen of the world. And so the idea, given that, and given how we know that there are people who are alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people born into slavery, the idea that anyone would suggest that history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality, the idea that anyone would suggest that history does not profoundly shape our social, political, and economic infrastructure is being morally and intellectually disingenuous. And so I think for me, that is what I began this project thinking about, how the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us. And it gave me a different sense of our collective physical proximity to this history. And I think in doing so, what it did was subsequently give me a different sense of our collective temporal proximity to that history. And as a result, it just made it so much clearer to me that this history was so recent and that we can't teach it or understand it as something that has nothing to do with the world that we live in today, but is something that has everything to do with the world we live in today. And I think that, more than anything, is what I hope people leave the book with.